When Leonardo DiCaprio finished filming the iconic "I'm the King of the World" scene on Titanic, something happened that would haunt him for years. Director James Cameron called cut, but what the cameras didn't capture was the young actor collapsing behind the ship's railing, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. What really happened that day in 1996 changed DiCaprio forever. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to comment where you're listening to this from. Now, let's get into the story. December 15, 1996, Halifax, Nova Scotia. The morning fog hung thick over the North Atlantic as the massive replica Titanic ship creaked against its moorings. At 22 years old, Leonardo DiCaprio stood on the deck, staring at the gray waters below, his stomach churning with more than just seasickness. For the past 3 months of filming, Leo had been hiding a secret that was slowly eating him alive. Every morning when he stepped onto this floating monument to disaster, his palms would sweat, his heart would race, and his mind would transport him back to a summer day 15 years earlier when everything changed. It was 1981. 7-year-old Leonardo was at his neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez's pool party in Los Angeles. The other kids were laughing, splashing, having the time of their lives. But Leo, who couldn't swim well, had been pushed into the deep end by an older boy as a joke. The water rushed into his lungs as he sank to the bottom, his small arms flailing helplessly. The world went silent, then black. When he woke up, Mrs. Rodriguez was performing CPR, her tears falling on his face as he coughed up chlorinated water. That day, water became his enemy. Now, standing on the deck of this replica ship, surrounded by thousands of gallons of the Atlantic Ocean, Leo felt like that helpless 7-year-old again. James Cameron, the notoriously demanding director, had already put the cast through 47 grueling takes of various scenes. Kate Winslet had hypothermia twice. The crew was exhausted. But Cameron's perfectionism was legendary, and Leo knew that today's scene, the famous King of the World moment, had to be flawless. "DiCaprio," Cameron's voice boomed across the deck. "You ready for this? We've got perfect wind, perfect light. This is our shot." But Leo wasn't ready. His hands trembled as he gripped the railing, the metal cold against his skin. Below him, the dark water stretched endlessly, and for a moment, he could swear he heard Mrs. Rodriguez's voice calling his name. The other actors watched him curiously. To them, he was just concentrating, getting into character. They had no idea that inside, Leonardo DiCaprio was fighting the battle of his life. "Action!" The word cut through the ocean breeze like a knife. Leonardo climbed onto the railing with movements that looked confident to the camera, but felt terrifying to him. Every fiber of his being screamed to get down, to run, to hide. But Jack Dawson wouldn't run. Jack Dawson was fearless, alive, ready to conquer the world. Leo spread his arms wide, feeling the wind whip through his hair, and channeled every ounce of courage he'd ever possessed. "I'm the king of the world!" The words burst from his lungs, carrying with them not just Jack's joy, but Leo's desperate attempt to overcome his deepest fear. The cameras captured the iconic moment perfectly. The wind, the light, the pure exuberance on his face, it was movie magic. But the moment James Cameron yelled, "Cut!" something inside Leonardo shattered. His legs buckled beneath him. The confidence that had carried him through the scene evaporated instantly, leaving behind only raw, paralyzing terror. He collapsed behind the ship's railing, out of view of the cameras, gasping for air as if he were drowning all over again. Kate Winslet was the first to reach him. She'd been watching from nearby, and something in his expression after the scene had alarmed her. "Leo? Leo, what's happening?" She knelt beside him as his entire body shook uncontrollably. The hyperventilation was so severe that he couldn't speak. His vision blurred, his chest felt like it was being crushed, and all he could see was that pool, that water, that moment when he thought he was going to die. The ship's medic, a weathered man named Dr. Murphy who'd worked on films for 20 years, rushed over with his medical kit. "Panic attack," he diagnosed quickly, placing an oxygen mask over Leo's face. Everyone give him space. But the cast and crew couldn't help but stare. This was Leonardo DiCaprio, the rising star, the heartthrob who was supposed to carry this $200 million movie, and he was falling apart. For 30 minutes, Leo sat wrapped in emergency blankets. his breathing slowly returning to normal. James Cameron approached cautiously, his usual commanding presence replaced by genuine concern. "Leo, I had no idea. If I had known—" But Leo shook his head weakly. It wasn't Cameron's fault. How could he have known about the drowning, about the nightmares, about the way Leo had to take Dramamine not just for seasickness, but for panic attacks every time he saw large bodies of water? That evening, alone in his small trailer overlooking Halifax Harbor, Leo did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He called his mother and cried. That night changed everything. As Leonardo DiCaprio listened to her son's sobbing voice over the crackling phone line, she made a decision that would alter the course of his career. "Mijo," she said in her gentle German accent, "you don't have to finish this movie. Come home. We'll figure something else out." But as Leo lay in his narrow trailer bed, listening to the waves crash against the harbor, something shifted inside him. He thought about Jack Dawson, about the character's fearlessness, his zest for life despite coming from nothing. Jack wouldn't run from his fears. Maybe it was time for Leo to stop running from his. The next morning, Leo arrived on set 2 hours early. The makeup department was surprised to see him there, sitting quietly in the chair, staring at his reflection. When James Cameron walked in with his usual morning coffee, he found Leo waiting for him. "We need to talk," Leo said, his voice steadier than it had been in months. For the next hour, in Cameron's cluttered director's trailer, Leonardo DiCaprio did something he'd never done with anyone except his mother. He told the truth. He talked about the pool, about Mrs. Rodriguez, about the nightmares that still woke him up sometimes. He explained how every water scene in the movie felt like a form of torture, how he'd been taking anxiety medication just to get through the days. Cameron listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. When Leo finished, the trailer was silent except for the gentle rocking of the ship and the distant sound of the crew preparing for the day's shoot. "Why didn't you tell me this 3 months ago?" Cameron finally asked. Leo looked down at his hands. "Because I was afraid you'd fire me, replace me with someone who wasn't broken." Cameron leaned back in his chair, processing everything he'd just heard. Then he said something that surprised not just Leo, but everyone who overheard it through the thin trailer walls. "Leo, that fear you're carrying, that trauma, that's not weakness, that's the key to making Jack Dawson real." Cameron stood up and began pacing the small space. "Every great performance comes from truth, from some deep place of human experience. You've been trying to hide your fear, but what if instead you used it? What if Jack's fearlessness comes from someone who knows what it's like to be afraid?" That afternoon, they reshot the King of the World scene. But this time, instead of trying to suppress his terror, Leo embraced it. The vulnerability in his eyes, the slight catch in his voice, the way his hands trembled just slightly on the railing. It all came from a real place of courage, the courage to face what terrified him most. The real test came with the water scenes. The massive tank where they filmed Jack and Rose's final moments was kept at a brutal 40 degrees Fahrenheit to simulate the North Atlantic. While other actors complained about the cold, Leo was fighting an entirely different battle. Each time he had to enter that tank, his body would betray him. His breathing would become shallow, his vision would tunnel, and he'd have to grip the edge until his knuckles turned white, reminding himself that this was just a movie set, not Mrs. Rodriguez's pool, not death. On the 7th take of Jack's death scene, something extraordinary happened. As Leo lay in the freezing water, clinging to the makeshift raft, watching Kate deliver Rose's final words to Jack, he stopped fighting the fear. Instead of pushing down the memory of drowning, he let it wash over him. The terror, the helplessness, the moment when he thought his life was over, all of it became part of Jack's final moments. The performance that emerged was raw, honest, heartbreaking. James Cameron, watching through the camera viewfinder, saw the exact moment when Leo stopped acting and started being. There was this transformation, Cameron would later say in interviews. The fear didn't disappear. It transformed into something else entirely, into truth, into art. When they pulled Leo from the water after that take, he didn't collapse this time. He stood there, dripping and shivering, with tears mixing with the tank water on his face. But these weren't tears of panic. They were tears of release, of finally facing the demon that had haunted him for 15 years. Kate Winslet, who had watched Leo struggle through months of filming, wrapped him in a warm robe and held him tight. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." The entire crew, who had witnessed Leo's transformation from a terrified young actor to someone who had faced his deepest fear, broke into spontaneous applause. They knew they'd witnessed something rare in Hollywood, the moment when an actor discovers not just their craft, but themselves. That night, Leo sat alone on the ship's deck, looking out at the same waters that had terrified him for months. They were still dark, still vast, still capable of taking life, but they were no longer his enemy. He thought about 7-year-old Leonardo, about Mrs. Rodriguez, about all the years he'd spent avoiding pools, beaches, any body of water larger than a bathtub. Tomorrow they would wrap filming on Titanic. In a year, the movie would make him the biggest star in the world. But tonight, sitting under the Nova Scotia stars, Leo felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: peace with the water. 28 years have passed since that December day in Halifax, and Leonardo DiCaprio has become one of the most respected actors of his generation. He's won an Oscar, starred in countless films, and used his platform to fight climate change. But he's never forgotten that moment on the Titanic set when his greatest fear became his greatest teacher. In his Malibu home, overlooking the Pacific Ocean that once terrified him, Leo keeps a small, framed photo on his desk. It's not from the famous King of the World scene, but from moments after his panic attack, when he was wrapped in emergency blankets, looking vulnerable and human. The irony of his post-Titanic career isn't lost on anyone who knows his story. The man who was once terrified of water has spent years on boats, documenting the effects of climate change on our oceans. He's dived with sharks, sailed through Arctic waters, and filmed documentaries in some of the most dangerous marine environments on Earth. When journalists ask him about this transformation, he often smiles and says, "Titanic taught me that running from your fears only makes them stronger. The moment you turn and face them, everything changes." James Cameron, now one of Leo's closest friends in the industry, still keeps that photo on his own desk. "That was the moment I knew we had captured something special," he says. "Not just a great performance, but the birth of a great actor. Leo didn't just play Jack Dawson, he became him by facing the very thing that scared him most." Kate Winslet, who won an Oscar herself, partly due to the authentic chemistry she shared with Leo during those difficult months, often speaks about watching her friend transform. "It was like seeing someone shed their skin and become who they were always meant to be," she remembers. Today, when young actors ask Leonardo DiCaprio for advice about overcoming their fears, he always tells them the same story. "I almost let my trauma end my career before it really began," he explains. "But the moment I stopped running from what scared me and started running toward it, everything changed. Your fears aren't obstacles, they're doorways to your best work." Every time he sees that iconic scene in Titanic, Leo doesn't remember the fame or the acclaim that followed. He remembers the terrified 22-year-old who found his courage in the middle of the North Atlantic, and he smiles. The water that once represented death and terror now represents transformation and life. And sometimes, late at night in his Malibu home, Leo walks out to his pool. Yes, he finally has a pool, and floats on his back, looking up at the stars, grateful for the journey that brought him from that scared little boy to the man he became. Mrs. Rodriguez, now in her 80s, still lives in Los Angeles. Leo visits her every Christmas, and they sit by her pool, the same pool where it all began, and she tells him how proud she is of the man who turned his deepest fear into his greatest strength. This is the incredible true story of how Leonardo DiCaprio's childhood trauma became the foundation of his greatest performance and launched him into superstardom. Thank you for listening to this journey of fear, courage, and transformation. Don't forget to rate our story out of 10 in the comments and tell us which other Leonardo DiCaprio story you'd like us to explore next. Until next time, remember that sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest sources of strength.